It's a farm in a valley in western Norway, a day inland from the fjord. It's the year 1000. And in 6 weeks, you are going to move indoors with 14 other people and 8 cattle. And you are not coming out again until spring. Not visiting, living. Roughly 6 months in one room, with a fire down the middle of the floor and a hole in the roof above it. On a bad night outside, it's minus 15 degrees Celsius, 5 Fahrenheit. There is no chimney. There is no window. There is no fuel you didn't cut down yourself. No clothing you didn't grow on an animal you personally fed. And there is nothing, anywhere, at any price that you can buy. And you're going to be fine. Not fine as in lucky. Fine as in this is an ordinary November. Fine as in you will do this again next year and the year after that for 60 years. Here's what I want to fix before we go any further, because everything else follows from it. When we picture this, we picture the wrong man. We picture a raider. Furs, an axe, a boat, and a high tolerance for weather. And that man existed. He is just not the man standing in this room. Viking isn't a people. It's a job. The word means going raiding, and almost nobody had that job. The man next to you at this fire has never been on a raid, will never go on one, and has no interest in going on one. He has 40 sheep and a hay problem. So I'll say it once and then leave it alone. The second thing we get wrong is bigger. We think the problem is cold. Cold isn't a thing, it's an absence. What is actually happening is this. You are a 37-degree object, 98.6 Fahrenheit, standing in a room that would very much like to be minus 15. And heat only ever travels one way. Out of you, into the room, through the wall, into Norway. Continuously. Whether you are awake or asleep, whether you are brave or not. So the question is never, how did they stand it? The question is, where does the energy come from, and how do you stop it leaving? That's an engineering problem. And they solved it with a building, an animal, and a fiber. Because the answer we all reach for first is toughness. They were hardy. They were used to it. They were built differently. That's wrong. And it's wrong in an interesting way, because toughness is not a thermal property. There is no version of being hardy that changes your thermal conductivity. Their bodies ran at the same 37 degrees yours does, with the same margins, and the margins are thin. Drop your core temperature by 2 degrees, and your fingers stop doing what you tell them. Not from pain, from loss of function. Drop it by 4, and your judgment goes before your grip does, which is the dangerous part, because you no longer believe there's a problem. Drop it by 6, and a real number of people take their clothes off, lie down in the snow, and die warm. That is a documented pattern in modern hypothermia cases. Being hardy does not protect you from it. So no, not toughness. And while we're removing things you think you know, the horns. There were never any horns. Not one Viking Age helmet with horns has ever been found, anywhere, because they did not exist. They were designed in 1876 by a costume designer called Carl Emil Doppler for the first full staging of Wagner's Ring Cycle at Bayreuth. He put horns and wings on the singers, and they have been on every Viking in every classroom and every cereal advert since. Horned helmets are real, incidentally. There's a pair from Vexo in Denmark, pulled out of a bog in 1942. Beautiful, ceremonial, and about 1800 years too early. Bronze Age. That is further from a Viking than a Viking is from you. And the actual helmet? We have one. One near-complete Viking Age helmet from Germanbu in Norway, found in 1943. An iron cap with a spectacle-shaped guard over the eyes. 2.5 centuries, 4 countries, 1 helmet. Which tells you what these people were spending their iron on, and it was not hats. All right, 3 moves. That's the whole system, and everything else is increasingly good versions of these 3. 1. Make the building hold heat. 2. Put heat sources inside the building that are not the fire. 3. Put a layer on your body that keeps working when it is wet, because you live in a maritime climate and it is going to be wet. Trap it, generate it, wear it. The turf, the cattle, the fleece, the fire, the hay, and the smoke you are going to be breathing for the rest of your life. Move 1. The house is a blanket. The building you're standing in is a longhouse, and the wall is a meter thick. Not a meter of stone, a meter of turf. Cut sods of earth and grass roots, stacked like brickwork, sometimes in herringbone courses because that sheds water better, on a footing of rubble stone, with a timber frame inside carrying the roof. The roof is turf as well, with grass growing on it. In Iceland, the whole floor is often set down into the ground, so the earth comes partway up the walls from outside. Our best look at one is Stong in southern Iceland, a farm buried by an eruption of Hekla in 1104 and excavated in 1939, which means the walls are still standing where they were abandoned. The Norse equivalent of a house with the furniture left in it. In the 1970s, Iceland built a full-scale working reconstruction of it nearby, Þjóðveldisbærin, and people have been putting sensors inside that building ever since. Now, here is the part I would get wrong if I weren't careful. Turf is a mediocre insulator. It's soil. Soil holds water, and wet soil conducts heat perfectly happily. A meter of damp turf is not the equivalent of a modern wall stuffed with mineral wool. It isn't close. So the turf wall isn't insulation, it's a battery. A meter of earth weighs an enormous amount, and anything that weighs an enormous amount takes a long time to change temperature. The wall doesn't stop heat, it delays it. It soaks up the warmth of the room through the day and hands it back at 4 in the morning. It flattens the gap between noon and midnight, and between a mild week and a cold snap. Outside, the temperature swings 20 degrees. Inside, it barely registers, because that swing has to travel through a meter of soil first, and by the time it arrives, it's next week. And then they stack the cheap winds on top of it. The door is low, so you stoop, so the warm air at head height stays where it is. There are no windows, not small windows, none. A window is a hole, and a hole is the entire problem. The building is long and narrow and low, so there is very little air per person to heat, and there is exactly one deliberate opening in the whole structure, the smoke hole in the roof. In Old Norse, the ljori. One hole, directly above the fire, doing a chimney's job badly, on purpose. Because a chimney is a machine for pulling warm air out of a building, and they could not afford one. That design traveled, by the way. When Norse settlers reached Newfoundland around the year 1000, at the site we now call Lance aux Meadows, found in 1960, they built the same thing. Turf walls, timber frame, sunken floor. New continent, same wall, move 2. And this is the one I want you to walk away with. Go to the far end of the house. Depending on where you are and which century you're in, you either keep walking straight into the byre, same roof, same building, sometimes not even a partition, or you go out through a short turf passage into a byre a few steps away. Either way, the cattle are indoors, and they are indoors from October to May. We usually explain that as shelter. The animals would die outside, so you bring them in. True. And it is half of what is going on. The other half is that they are heating your house. A cow is a metabolism. It runs slightly warmer than you do, it eats more or less continuously, and nearly all of the energy it does not turn into milk or muscle leaves it as heat. Norse cattle were small. Think a shaggy animal you can see over the back of, a long way from a modern dairy breed. But even being careful about it, an animal that size at rest is putting out something like 500 watts. 8 of them is 4 kilowatts. Let me put that in something you can buy. 4 kilowatts is 2 decent electric radiators, on full, day and night. Run that for the 200 days those animals are inside, and you're at roughly 19,000 kilowatt hours of heat. That is about 7 times the electricity a typical British household gets through in an entire year. At current prices, it is several thousand pounds of heating. The cattle supply it for nothing. The cow isn't livestock. It's a 500-watt heater that walks itself indoors in October, pays a dividend in dairy, and makes more of itself. And there is more than heat in that end of the building. The dung goes onto the fields in spring, and it is the only reason those fields still grow anything after 300 years. And the byre is where the winter's most reliable food supply is standing in the dark, quietly turning hay into milk. I'm not going to tell you they built it that way for the heat. You can't read intention off a post hole. What I will say is that the arrangement has that effect, that they can hardly have failed to notice it, because you can feel it walking from one end of a byre house to the other, and that they went on building this way for a very long time. Nobody in Norway in the year 1000 knew that a cow was 500 watts. They knew that end of the house was warmer, and they built towards it for 4 centuries. That's not knowledge, that's iteration. And iteration is what this whole channel is about. Move 3. The layer on your body. And this is where the sheep turns out to be the most important animal in the Norse world. Start with the animal, because the animal is already doing half the work. Norse sheep were double-coated, the same type as the Icelandic sheep and the Norwegian villsow you can still go and look at today. There is a long, coarse, greasy outer coat that sheds water, and underneath it, a short, fine, dense inner coat that traps air. Old Norse has separate words for the two: tog for the outer, fel for the inner. 2 coats, 2 names, 2 jobs. The fleece isn't a raw material. It's already a 2-layer garment, and the sheep grew both halves. What matters most is the grease. Unwashed wool carries lanolin, up to about 1/5 of the weight of a raw fleece, and lanolin repels water, which is why wool is the one fiber that still insulates when it's damp. The crimp in the fiber holds its air pockets open even with water in the cloth. There's a bonus almost nobody hears about. Wool gives off a small amount of heat as it takes up moisture. The effect is modest, but the practical version is that a wool cloak in drizzle does not turn into a cold, wet sheet. A linen one does. In a maritime climate, that isn't a nice feature. That's the whole game. Norway's winter problem is not only the -15, it's the +2 with rain in it, which will take you apart faster if your clothing gives up the moment it's wet. So let's price it. A sheep gives you somewhere around 1.5 kilos of usable wool a year. A full winter outfit, tunic, trousers, cloak, hood, leg wraps, socks, is several kilos of finished cloth. So before anybody spins a single thread, you are already 3 or 4 sheep years in. Then the work. Estimates for hand spinning put 1 square meter of woolen cloth at somewhere around 10 hours on a spindle, and that is before you thread the loom. Call the outfit 100 hours of spinning. At the British minimum wage, call it £12 an hour, that's 1,200 pounds of labor in 1 set of clothes. And it only feels free because a woman in your household did it in the dark while somebody else recited a poem. And the object at the end of all that? We have one. From the Coppergate excavation in York, a 10th century wool sock, made by needle binding, because knitting had not reached Europe yet. Somebody's actual sock, out of somebody's actual winter, sitting in a pit for 1,100 years. The sock isn't clothing. It's the reason your foot still works in March. Here is what we don't know, and it's the thing you'd most want to know. We do not know how cold it actually got in that room. Nobody in the year 1000 owned a thermometer, so there is no number to go and find. What we have instead is reconstructions, Thjodveldesperen and others, and people have put sensors in them and published figures, and those figures are argued about, correctly, because a reconstruction is a modern building. It was built with modern tools by people who do not live inside it for 6 months. It usually has no cattle in the byre end. Its turf has a different moisture history. Its fire is lit for visitors rather than banked every night for 20 years. Every one of those changes the answer, and some of them change it a lot. So the honest summary is a range and a shrug. Above freezing near the fire, almost certainly. Cold enough at the far end that the far end is where the animals went. Somewhere between a British house in 1975 and a fridge, depending on the night, the wind, and how many bodies were in the room. Anyone who hands you a single number for this is guessing. It is a good question and we cannot answer it. All right, here is where this whole story turns over. Everything I have described is a heat system: turf, cattle, wool, fire. And I have been talking about it as though winter is a problem you solve in winter. It isn't. Every one of those 3 moves runs on work you had to have finished already. And the deadline was July. The turf was cut in summer. The wool was on the sheep last spring and has to be plucked, sorted, spun, and woven long before you need it. And the 4 kilowatt heating system at the end of the house eats. A small cow gets through something like 7 kilos of dry hay a day, and it is inside for 200 days. So that's a ton and a half per animal. 8 animals is well over 10 tons of hay, and every kilo of it was cut with a short-bladed scythe, turned by hand to dry, and carried in. On the rough numbers, that is more than a month of one person's mowing in a Norwegian summer, which is not a dependable place to dry grass. So the real Norse winter technology is not turf and it is not wool. It's a scythe, and about 3 dry weeks in July. Hay isn't animal feed. It's the fuel for the heating system. And the heating system has 4 legs. And this is where the accounting gets brutal, because it's arithmetic you have to do in autumn. You count the hay. You count the animals. If the hay will not cover the animals, you do not get to hope. You slaughter the difference in October. The autumn slaughter is not a festival. It's a spreadsheet. It's even in the literature, though hold this one loosely. Njál's saga was written down around 1280, about events around the year 1000, by a Christian about pagans. In it, a man runs short of hay in a bad year, goes to a neighbor to buy some, and is refused. What comes out of that refusal is a chain of killings that runs most of the length of the book. Not gold, not land, hay. So here's the picture, and then I'll get out of the way. It's February in a valley in western Norway. A low turf building with grass on the roof and snow on the grass. And it is genuinely hard to see where the field stops and the house starts. A meter of earth in the wall, holding last Tuesday's warmth. 1 hole in the roof with a column of smoke going up through it. And under the rafters, a flat gray layer of that smoke you can put your hand into if you stand up too quickly. A fire down the middle of the floor that has not been allowed to go out since the house was built. 14 people along 2 benches, in their clothes, under wool that took 100 hours to make. 8 cattle at the far end, breathing, turning July into heat. And not one person in that building thinking any of it is clever. Because it isn't clever. It's just what you do. The answer was never toughness. It was earth, animals, grease, and a scythe. Here's what I keep coming back to. Every single thing in that building is a decision about margins. How thick to cut the wall. How many animals to keep. How much hay is enough. And when the margins moved, the system went with them. The Norse farms in Greenland ran this exact playbook in a place with less grass and a shorter summer. And after 400 odd years, for a tangle of reasons people are still arguing about, with climate somewhere in the middle of it, the arithmetic stopped working and those farms emptied. You are going to be cold at some point this winter, and you'll do something about it. Turn something up, put something on. Same species, same 37 degrees, same 2 degrees of slack before your hands stop working. The only thing that has actually changed is that somebody else cuts your hay. One question, and I would genuinely like the answer to this one. You've got the whole system now. A meter of turf, 8 animals, and a fleece. If you had to give one of them up, only one, which one goes? And how do you get through February without it?